So it's my great pleasure now to introduce Andrew. Andrew is Professor of English, Media and Drama and the Director of DARE, which is the Digital Arts Research and Education Centre, which is a research collaboration with the BFI, the British Film Institute. I also wanted to, on a personal note, as Robin did with Pat, just kind of reflect on what a generous colleague Andrew's been over the years. I've worked with Andrew on several projects now, and every time I've really enjoyed the opportunity of collaborating with him to do some work in media, technology and the arts. And so tonight I'm really pleased that he accepted our offer, and I think it's going to be a really interesting counterpoint to what Pat's been saying as well. So really looking forward to this contribution. Now, this is videoed, so we're going to avoid dropouts and that kind of thing. Thomas is going to roll the video in a second. And then after that video, we'll come back live with Andrew. We'll do some questions with Andrew, so feel free to use the chat box to post any questions. And then after that, we'll do a chat, a brief plenary with Pat and Andrew at the end. So let's roll the tape. Thomas, thanks.
Good afternoon in Australia. Good morning here in the UK. Thanks very much for inviting me to speak at this conference. So I'm going to talk about creativity, literacy, and the digital rhapsode, about which all will be revealed. I'm going to talk about these in relation to young people's digital game designs as transformations of literary texts, specifically Shakespeare's Macbeth. So I want to think about creativity and literacy in relation to play. And this first idea from Johann Huizinga's work Homo Ludens in 1938 makes the point that there's a close affinity between poetry, literature, and play. There is, as he says always, a play element at work in the myth, the lyric, the drama, or the epic. The writer's aim is to create a tension that will enchant the reader and hold him or her spellbound. Also very much the aim of video game design. The second big idea is from Vygotsky, and as we know, Vygotsky saw creativity in childhood and adolescence as emerging from childhood play and the process of imagination, the work of imagination and fantasy in childhood, in which imagination could take fragments from the child's existing cultural experience and recombine them. Vygotsky saw imagination as combinatorial, making new impossible meanings out of familiar old ones. We also know that Vygotsky's argument was that this kind of imaginative work in play in childhood evolves into true creativity when it's subordinated to a kind of rational process. And later in this talk, we'll look at rational processes such as the construction of narrative or the construction of game architecture. In order to explore these things, we also need to think about the nature of literacy. So I'm going to argue that literacy, to use an old model which I've used many times before, can be seen in three different ways. First of all, cultural. So we have literacy is a cultural experience. It builds on our cultural experience, in this case perhaps of playful cultures, but also, as we'll see, of literature. That it's critical, it involves a critical understanding of the ways in which, in this case, play and digital games, but also literature, are structured, are used, convey particular forms of political meaning. And also the ways in which literacy is creative. It's about reading, but it's also about writing. It's about the analysis of media texts, but also about the creative production of them. So how might learners transform cultural resources in the way that Vygotsky suggests and subject them to conceptual frameworks, and what might those frameworks be? what role would imagination play, and also, again, to refer to Vygotsky, what tools would be used. And for Vygotsky, tools could be conceptual or they could be technological. So to look at this, I'm going to be giving examples which are made in a game authoring tool called Mission Maker. And this is a 3D game authoring tool. The idea here is that games are a cognate form very close to literature and film. And therefore, they're quite legitimately part of the English curriculum. They're another form of storytelling. I'm just going to run through 3 projects. And these are all projects in which I and my colleagues wanted to find out what would happen if we used the idea of the Mission Maker software specifically to make games based on canonical literary texts. So the first one of these is a project called Playing Shakespeare, which we did in 2012 with the Globe. The second project was called Playing Beowulf, and this was a collaboration with the British Library, which of course owns the unique manuscript of Beowulf. And the third project, we returned to Macbeth in this project, but this time in collaboration with the British Library, which owns a number of copies of Shakespeare's First Folio. So with that in mind, what did we learn from these projects? I'm going to go through them fairly quickly with some of them, and I'll spend a bit of time lingering on the last one if I have time. So the first one, this was the project with the Globe, if you remember. We learned something about the way in which you might code Shakespeare. What does it mean to produce a version of the play, which in many ways is like staging a theatre version of it? We have a set, we have characters, we construct dramatic action, albeit with digital characters rather than human ones. But underneath that, there's something more profound going on in a way, which is not at all like theatre, and that is that the game is coded. So, for example, in this clip from this screenshot from the design interface of Mission Maker at that point, this is made by 2 girls, 2 13-year-old Year 9 girls, and they've been allocated the murder of Duncan. That's the scene to change into a video game. And this is the moment at which Macbeth arrives at Duncan's bedchamber. And you can see that at the bottom of the screen, it's rather small writing, but there's a 3-part rule which says, if Crown's state becomes owned by player, player gains 500 economy A points. Now, economy A, there are 3 economies in this program. These are quantified assets. In the original Mission Maker, they were hunger, strength, and so on. With encouragement from the Globe, what we did in this project was take the labels off them so that the students could call them anything they wanted. So in this project, they called them things like bloodthirstiness, conscience, courage, ambition, power, and so on. And I think in this case, the girls have changed the name of economy A, the first of the 3 economies, to be ambition. So if they pick up the crown, which you can see there in the play screen, and it becomes owned by them, it becomes an object in their inventory, then they gain 500 economy A points, 500 ambition points, and that changes the state of the player later in the game. So that's an example of a piece of code. Here's a second example. So this is the scene a little bit earlier, just as the player, as Macbeth, in the form of Macbeth, approaches Duncan's bedchamber and meets the 2 guards outside. Now the guards are sleeping, although in the design interface here they appear to be standing up. When you play the game, they're asleep. And around them you can see these transparent cylinders, which are known as trigger volumes. And the point of a trigger volume is it's a piece of programmable space. It'll be invisible to the player. It's only visible in the design interface. And the girls have programmed these cylinders. And you can see the rule at the bottom right-hand side. If player is inside cylinder trigger 9, guard 2 seeks and destroys player. So in the game, you can't see them. But if you bump into cylinder trigger 9, the guard will wake up and will start to attack you. So they've created through coding a kind of tension, a kind of dynamism that resembles the dynamism of the play itself. If you were inhabiting it, if you like, as a player, you're creeping through the forechamber. You can see the guards asleep. You've got to be careful not to wake them up. You know that. Otherwise, your mission is in big difficulties. So you creep past them. And in this case, the creeping past them is encoded in the cylinder triggers. So a different way to think about dramatic tension, about the proximity of bodies in dramatic space, perhaps, and so on. Different way to think about narrative. Here's a video capture of their game, so you can see how the narrative unrolls.
What beast was then that made you break this enterprise to me? When you durst do it, then you were a man.
All hail Thane of Fordham.
God bless us.
Still it cried, sleep no more to all the house. Clowns have murdered sleep, and therefore Corden shall sleep no more. Macbeth shall sleep no more.
Here's another example. This is from last year's project, playing Macbeth with the British Library. And these are the students from Bishop Challoner School in London. So you can see a girl at the bottom, and she's been allocated the scene in which Lady Macduff and her son are murdered. And she's noticed in this scene, in fact, that although we see the murder of the son, we don't see the murder of Lady Macduff. In fact, both these murders occur right at the end of the scene and are only really described in a stage direction. There's a stage direction related to the son of Macduff, which just says dies, and then another stage direction which says that Lady Macduff runs out of the room, followed by the murderer. So what she's done is she's exploited a gap in the text. We don't know what happens to her after she leaves the room. We assume she's been killed, but we're not told that until the next scene, when Macduff is given the news by Ross that his wife and children have been killed. So she's taken that gap and she thought, what happens then? And in the game, you see her looking in horror on the bloody corpse of her son and rushing. Well, she doesn't rush out of the door because you are playing Lady Macduff. It's your choice. You could just stand there and be killed, because the murderers are planned to seek and destroy you. It's been coded in the rules of the game by this girl, who is a GCSE student, by the way, in year 10. So you can invade them. You can outrun the murderers. You can just keep on, and they'll keep on chasing you. It's a rather horrific prospect because there's no end to it. She's created a kind of endless run as a sort of horrifying insertion into the narrative of Macbeth. She hasn't done this entirely at random. It turns out, in talking to her afterwards, that she's thinking of a simple phone-based running game called Temple Run, which is entirely based around the mechanism of running. So she's thinking of this as in relation to popular culture and the game mechanics of this small popular cultural text. And she's kind of adapted that to exploit this gap in the text of Macbeth. Here's another example, the final one, also from Bishop Challoner. So this girl has been allocated the scene in which Banquo and Fleance are attacked and Banquo is murdered. And she's looking carefully at the characters of the three murderers, and she's trying to distinguish between them, and she seizes on a little bit of the text, which seems to suggest that one of the murderers is a more sympathetic character than the other two, murderer number 2. And she thinks about whether the player could take that role, the player's avatar could be murderer number 2. And that although he has to kill Banquo, he may feel sorry for Fleance and allow him to escape, which would fit the narrative of the play, but be an interesting twist. So it wouldn't be that Fleance had escaped, it would be that the murderer had compassionately allowed him to escape. And you then have to return as that character to the other two murderers and lie to them and say that Fleance managed to escape in spite of your best efforts. So again, she's like the previous example, she's maintaining the integrity of the play's narrative, but she's playing around with this detailed little section of it, expanding it, if you like, expanding the narrative, thinking about the character, thinking about the motivation of the character, and making a sort of judicious change to the play, which gives the avatar some choices.
But murderer number 1 and murderer number 2 both seem like they're arguing with each other of which one of them they should trust, and whether murderer number 1 should trust murderer number 2. So we were thinking of whether or not we should make murderer number 2. Murderer number 2 seems more like he's trying to resolve the situation and seems to try to calm both of them down. So he seems the most sympathetic out of both of them. So how about we make sure that murderer number 2 is the traitor of the group, and he eventually lets Fleance escape, then comes back to the other 2 murderers and lies to them and tells them that they let him go. The 2 murderers were supposed to go and kill Banquo, and while the 2 murderers were killing Banquo, one of the murderers, us, we were supposed to chase after Fleance while he ran away, and there's going to be this big elaborate chasing of us and Fleance, and then it reached a point where we realized that we feel guilty for Fleance, of the guilt of the whole situation, and the avatar is given a choice of whether to kill Fleance or to let him live. And depending on which one he chose, at the end of the day, Fleance will still escape. But if the avatar was to pick to let him go, the avatar, had to go back to the murderers and lie to them, telling them that he escaped out of our reach when we let him go by ourselves.
She goes a bit further than that, though, and I'm indebted to Alison Crosdale, who managed to follow up this game-making workshop with some writing assignments in which the students explained what they were aiming for in their games, and also produced pieces of creative writing based on their game adaptations. So in this case, the girl imagines herself into the character, into the avatar of the murderer. So some more changes happen here. To begin with, the character becomes female, it becomes young, and it becomes black. It becomes a young black woman. And so in her piece of writing, she makes a lot of one of them questioning who sent you. And she imagines this as a kind of expression of surprise on the part of the other murderer. Who sent you? He says, scanning me, trying to decipher why a young lady as myself would have any business with such 5'9", curly brown bush heaped into a high ponytail, my cocoa-toned skin. I don't fit the standard norm of beauty enforced by society, neither do I squeeze into the expectations of women in society. Women of my age are supposed to be married off to some rich bloke in a manor scrubbing floors or preparing the meal by the house, practically only seen as baby-making machines. Not me. Never me. Outcast by society due to my appearance, I've been forced to go into the streets, stealing and selling just to get by. My pure hatred for the world, the only thing driving me on, and with that same hatred, brought me to this very moment. Macbeth, the name itself, bringing bile to my tongue, but I restrict myself from recoiling. So it's about identity. And she is, as I've suggested, inhabiting the text, taking this fairly briefly sketched character in the play and filling it up with meanings of her own, which she could do with a piece of writing and she could do in a piece of drama, but the fact that the character is an avatar makes a particular difference in terms of the choices it has available. Now, what about the digital rhapsode? We're familiar with talking about the idea of rhetoric in relation to literacy. Bill Green in Australia, for instance, and Richard Andrews in the UK have been foremost in promoting the importance of rhetoric as a foundational element of literacy, the use of persuasive language. We can also think about rhetoric in relation to digital games. Ian Bogost in America, for instance, has developed the concept of procedural rhetoric, in which games use procedural structures, rule-based systems, in order to persuade or to pull readers or players into a game text and so on. I want to add to this another idea which also originates with Aristotle, as does rhetoric, of course, and this originates in Aristotle's Poetics. And in the Poetics, Aristotle invokes the image of the ancient Greek rhapsode. The rhapsode's jobs really were to continue the Homeric tradition, to perform Homer. And they're interesting to me as a model for our young digital makers, partly because they're continuing a textual tradition in the way that our young makers here are transforming older texts, Beowulf, Macbeth. They're interpreting these in a kind of dynamic oral form. They're oral performers, and the Homeric texts were originally composed orally. And there's a kind of fluidity and improvisatory dynamism about video games, which seems to me to recapture some of this fluidity of oral composition, oral performance. They're also multimodal performers. You can see that the rhapsode here has a lyre. They used music, they used spoken language, as I've said. They're using ceremonial costume as part of the performance. And not dissimilarly, our students' games are multimodal. They escape the kind of linguistic constrictions of the English curriculum, and they create by using visual design, by using dramatic action in dramatic space, by using voice, by using music, and by using the mode of procedurality, of rule-making, of coding. And the coding brings me really to the final point about the rhapsode, which I think is provocative and interesting. And it's contained in the word rhapsode itself. And the word rhapsode is made up of two Greek words, rhaptein, which means to stitch, and oide, which means poetry. So the rhapsode was stitching poetry, and they were doing this through the processes of the oral formulaic tradition, stitching together language for new audiences. In the same way, I think our young people are unstitching the Shakespearean text and restitching it. They're stitching it in various ways. They're stitching it with drama, they're stitching it with language, they're stitching it with visual design, as I said. But they're also stitching it through the mode of code, as we saw in the first example. And code is another kind of formula. If the player owns the crown, the player gains 500 ambition points. It's another kind of formula. So if the Homeric performers were using the oral formulaic, Homeric epithets and so on, our young coders are using the language of programming, which is simultaneously the language of narrative and of conditionality in game design. So our young digital rhapsodes are restitching the Shakespearean text, a form of creativity which is not entirely original, but certainly not derivative, and which makes something new out of something old. And the word rhapsode also, I think, in its modern sense, its sense of lyricism, of a kind of musical, ecstatic sensibility, fits this form of creativity well, it seems to me. So what do we learn from those projects about the questions which I posed earlier in relation to creativity, literacy and play? So I think we can see clearly enough from those examples that the young people are reimagining the text of Macbeth. We use the word reimagining rather loosely these days in relation to any franchise. But in this case, they are taking fragments of the play, also gaps in the play, silences in the play, and they're prizing these apart, and they're inserting fragments of their own experience, their own references to popular culture, to mobile phone games, and other aspects of their gaming experience. One girl also incorporated her affiliation to goth culture by making a game which she felt was particularly gothic and inserting a small dragon which she used as a representation of the murdering ministers who Lady Macbeth invokes to fill her up with cruelty. So certainly reimagining. Criticality, we can see that there are some critical there's some critical purchase on concepts of character, concepts of narrative structure, concepts of affect and motivation in the play, represented through the manipulation of the game economies, and so on. So a criticality in relation to creativity. So reason and imagination, as Vygotsky argued for. There's a playing with literature, we can see. The literature, in a sense, is already playful. Macbeth is being treated here as a kind of template for a video game, which involves classic video game components. It involves combat, that Roger Caillois called the agonistic aspect of play in games. It involves problem solving, it involves missions, it involves rewards and punishments of various kinds that the students realise through, again, manipulating the economies. What about tools? So we can see, I think, that in Vygotsky's sense they're using conceptual tools. They're of course using the technological tools of the software. In relation to technology, I also wanted to mention another framework I've found helpful in thinking about creativity, and it's Heidegger's well-known essay on technology. And Heidegger begins with the idea of technology, but he starts off by thinking about technology as artisanal craft. And I think we could think of the students' work in this sense. They're artisan game designers. They're making a media text in a way that involves certain kinds of craft skill. But Heidegger moves on pretty quickly from that to the idea of episteme, or knowledge. And again, we can see that there are forms of knowledge here, and they're not just the kind of arguments for powerful knowledge that people like Michael Young have made recently, that are sometimes abused in curriculum policy as a kind of handing down of powerful knowledge from the educators to the educated. There are other kinds of knowledge. There's vernacular knowledge. There's the student knowledge of games and gaming cultures. There's the students' knowledge about the issues which surround them in their own world, about discrimination, about social class, about the conditions in which they live. Heidegger moves on from that to poiesis, the poetry, the Greek word for making, from which we derive our word poem, and poetry. So again, we can think about the poetics of digital game design and how they transform the poetics of literary texts. He moves on finally to the idea of aletheia, the Greek word for truth, which he characterizes as a kind of bringing forth of what is true. And truth is a problematic concept, but I want to think of it here in relation to the social semiotic idea of modality or truth claim. What kinds of claim to truth are these students making? To truth about themselves and their lives, their identities, their worlds, to the forms of cultural capital they can bring to bear in constructing these texts, which have to function as a kind of representation of a Shakespeare play, albeit one which they've kind of violently ripped apart and remodeled, of truth to genre, presentational modality, as Theo van Leuven calls it. So they want to make it into a believable, authentic, playable video game as well, as a representation, a true representation of their subcultural affiliations, as in the example of the goth girl that I mentioned a moment ago. So different kinds of truth claim made in relation to Heidegger's model. So that brings me pretty well to a close. I hope I've managed to make a case for a version of literacy which allies the rhetorical to the rhapsodic, the poetic, two sides of the same coin, again, I hope, and also has made a case for video games as a fluid improvisatory form of culture, of media art, which enables this model of literacy to be realised in certain ways. We could do this through drama, it's true, also, but the distinguishing feature of games is the code, the programming, which I've talked about in this presentation. And it provides some suggestions also for the curriculum location of this kind of work. I've presented it as an aspect of literacy that's obviously suited to the English classroom in the UK or Australia. It's also happily located in the context of media education, wherever we can find a niche for that in the curriculum. But the coding possibility allows also for, tantalizingly, for collaboration with computing and the teachers of computer science. Some way to kind of cross the pernicious, perennial art-science divide. A final point about creativity and literacy. We need to think about literacy in the service of creativity. Nobody wrote a poem to become more literate. Nobody made a video game or a film to show their media literacy. They make them for the immediate creative needs of the moment. And it's this, I think, that our models of literacy need to serve. Thanks very much for listening.
Andrew, I want to kick off by asking a question, really, which brings up the question that kind of was asked, I think, by the Playing Beowulf we did in Australia with, and I acknowledge Dave Cameron, who's online at the moment as well, which is when the forms of gaming, theatre, literature start to merge in some future hybridity, if that in fact happens, or even if VR finally lives up to its promise, will the kind of framework that you've set up tonight hold, or will that necessarily change? And what can you imagine changing in that?
Well, big question, Michael. Thank you very much.
Sorry, an easy one first.
I'm just thinking about which bits of the framework. I mean, the idea of the rhapsode, which I'm kind of interested in pushing because I think it's provocative in various ways, I think does hold, and it holds good actually for the arts in general. I was thinking of it in relation to that fantastic film by Tom earlier on, which seems to me to be absolutely rhapsodic in all the senses in which I've described. And I think that bit of the model does hold good and continues to provoke questions about why people are creative in any of these art forms, whether separately or together. And also something I didn't get to in the talk, the kind of status of the child or the student. You know, what are they? The rhapsodes were professional performers. Okay, so it could be objected that our students are not professional performers. So what are they exactly? I don't think amateur is the right word. Maybe there's some kind of apprentices, I'm not sure, or novice filmmakers, game designers, poets, or whatever it might be. But I think, I think that's an interesting question, and it's my point about the fact that the creativity is for the moment rather than for some imagined future, dear to the hearts of curriculum policymakers. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but at least...
Well, it's possibly unanswerable. So thanks for having a shot at it. There's been a question from Adam who asked about the platform that you use. Do you want to talk a little bit about Mission Maker, where it's been and where it's going to?
Yeah, so the current version, which works pretty well, we've got a version for Mac, a version for PC. If people email me, I can just send them a link, and it's very easy to install, and now much easier to use than it was when you and David used it for Beowulf, when it was still very buggy. So much better now. Get in touch with me and you can use it. It raises some interesting questions, for instance, about the vexed question of originality in creativity, because they're using it's Macbeth in the sense that they're making stuff that isn't original. And yes, of course, it is always new and it's always valuable. And similarly, they have pre-designed assets in the software that they're using. They haven't designed those 3D model characters or environments, they're adapting them and using them. But the question of creativity seems to me to be, as Vygotsky said, about the way in which these pre-existing cultural resources are recombined, you know.
Mm. And the final question from me, and please feel free to put up questions, anybody who has them, is in terms of what you're talking about with the relationship between literacy and creativity, there was kind of an implied or an implication that you see literacy not being in the service of creativity, but the other way around. Is that true? Is that my reading? And where are you seeing that in the culture or in schooling? And what do you see as the way for us to emerge from that situation into the situation you're suggesting?
It is really problematic, it seems to me, that in the curriculum, you know, the means are the arts and the end is the achievement of literacy or an A grade or whatever it might be. And it seems to me that we have this completely the wrong way around. I mean, the whole point of literacy is so that people can write the poems and make the video games and make the films. They're not making those things in order to become more literate. Nobody ever did that, except, of course, you know, for narrow exam purposes. And I think the way David Buckingham, for instance, who I was talking, you know, at a conference with on Saturday, talked about creativity and media education. And his argument was that the point of creativity was making, but it wasn't about self-expression. It was in order to help the kids get a better purchase on the critical concepts of media education. And I don't really agree with that. I think it does do that, but I think that's not the end. The end is something else, and it's to do with the creative needs, whether you call those self-expression or something else. And how to get over this, I think we get over it better outside the curriculum. You know, when teachers and kids are making a school play, for instance, and those kind of rather instrumental requirements of the curriculum fall away. Nobody does a school play and thinks, is this improving their literacy? You know, but the problem then is it becomes a kind of self-selected group participating, and it's not an entitlement for everybody in the curriculum. So very problematic.
I might bring Robin and Pat back in now just to kind of close off. And before I do that, as they're getting back online, Adam Caron's asked another question. Andrew mentioned a researcher who helped him realise creativity at the end of his session. Who was it?
Yeah, I should have explained that more clearly. I think I over-edited that piece to get it down to the half hour. I was talking about Alison Crosdale, I think, is who I mentioned. She is a researcher. She's a PhD researcher. She's my student, and she's working on this for her thesis at the moment. But she's the teacher of that class. So, you know, much in the same way that Pat's described the need for the collaboration between teachers and artists in the school, I think she had a powerful role in this project.
Yeah, that's great. I'm just going to ask Robin and Pat maybe to reflect on that last point that Andrew made around literacy and creativity, to see what your thoughts were on it, because I imagine it's something that would be of interest to both of you in terms of that often very stressed relationship between literacy and creativity. I'm just interested in your thoughts, if you have any, Pat or Robin. Go to you first, Pat, if you've got anything to add there.
I was being polite. I think there's a way of understanding literacy as kind of literacy in action. So what does literacy look like when it's made into curriculum and pedagogy, and so it becomes a kind of literate practices in the classroom? And certainly in the English context, I think there has been a push to make literacy into a highly mechanical kind of process. And, you know, so and this is not new. I think it's been there before, but it's come to be much more kind of dominant. So it's about the way that language works. And I think thinking about the way that language works is interesting. I'm not suggesting you don't need grammar or spelling or any of those things, but I think there are a lot of teachers who want to do other than that. And so there are a lot of, I guess, initiatives or moves around which are related to reading for pleasure, creative writing, literacy as a process of authoring something or other, whether it's a game or a play or a film. But I think it's difficult for those things to have a place in the curriculum. But I think at the moment in England, and it needs a school to take that on. I think it's about a school being committed to those kinds of approaches. So I guess that would be my response, is thinking about policy and how institutions frame what it is that teachers are actually able to do and what literacy is able to be, I think, in the classroom and what kids actually experience. I guess that's a sort of an immediate reflection, and we hold against that examples like Andrew's given, examples that I've seen of the RSC where you get, you know, 5-year-olds writing Elizabethan English and just playing with words and, you know, running around the playground going, you know, Gadzooksy be boiled, you know, and just having a lovely time. you know, playing. And I think it's that kind of sense that actually, like any semiotic system, this is about, as Andrew says, I absolutely support the idea that this is partly about kind of playing and experimenting and communicating and sharing and, you know, a kind of social conversation. And I just, you know, I just feel sad when I go into schools and see kids not being able to have that experience. You know, I've got a PhD person who's been in a school doing an ethnography for 12 months, and there are some books in the room, but in the 12 months she's been in the room, the teacher has never used them. I mean, these are 7-year-olds, 6 and 7-year-olds. I mean, and this is appalling in my view. Loads of bloody spelling comprehension.
And Robin, I mean, Pat's reflection on what literacy can be, my thinking about that is that's been a lot of your career, imagining and helping teachers imagine what literacy can be. I'm wondering about your thoughts on that.
Well, I echo a lot of what Pat has said. In Australia, we have an increasingly narrow and reductive definition of what literacy is. So, you know, by many policymakers and bureaucrats, and they are stifling the wonderful creative processes. In my view, I like to think of literacy in its broadest sense as about meaning making. You know, all of the different art forms are about meaning making in a whole range of different ways, and creating, you know, as Andrew talks about, you know, bringing their children, learners, young people bringing their own meanings to the process and reimagining it and making something new. But sadly, similarly to Pat's reflections, a lot of the time the perception is that very narrow and reductive skills have to be kind of grasped first. And yet if you look at the imagination, creativity of young children and the incredible things that they're capable of doing in play and in dramatic play and in all of the different art forms, you know, in a sense, we're dumbing it down far too often. And I think it's a huge problem, not just in Australia and you know, parts of the UK, but in lots of other places as well.
Robert, did you have any questions you wanted to put to either Pat or Andrew or both?
No, I mean, I just very much benefited from both presentations in terms of, you know, my own learning and understanding, and Andrew's certainly taken me to new understandings of mission maker and what students are able to do. I suppose my question would be, is a resource question. You know, in Australia, there are huge disparities between what children are able to do in some advantaged schools, whereas those in disadvantaged schools don't even necessarily have enough picture books, let alone, you know, the kind of resources that those students obviously had. Is that an issue? You know, the kind of equity issue?
Andrew, might go to you first.
I'm really sorry. I was just typing a response to a chat thing that somebody sent. I'm trying to multitask. Robin, can you just say the last bit again? Thanks.
I was just reflecting on the equity issues. Those students obviously had, you know, fabulous resources. In Australia, you know, there are huge disparities between what more advantaged schools can offer students in terms of those sorts of resources. And there are many schools that, you know, we found with COVID didn't even have, at Broken Hill, for example, 86% of the children didn't even have pencil and paper at home, let alone a laptop or anything. So, you know, to me, there's a huge gap in terms of equity.
Yeah, no, sure. I thought that was what it was. Just wanted to check. I've discussed this many times with people, actually. So, for instance, I mean, I would say that if any school has a computer or any kid has a computer, that software is free. It's very easy to install, and in that sense, it's not kind of resource heavy. If they don't have computers at all, then I've had people suggest ways of thinking about game design, for example. I've just been writing a book, actually, and I spent a bit of time in it thinking about a girl who made a board game of her favorite book, which was Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. And in a board game, you know, you have to think about the hinge points of the narrative. You have to think about, again, the kind of economies. I mean, it's quite like designing, you know, numerical economies, quite like designing a video game. So there's that kind of thing. There's writing pitches for games. There's doing live action role play in relation to video games. There's concept art for video games. There's fan writing and fan art. So there's a lot of things you can do with no resources other than the pen and paper, I think. So yeah, that's a few practical examples.
Pat, when we'll probably finish with your comment this evening. So what are your thoughts on the resource gap?
Oh, well, it's huge. You know, it's huge in Australia, and it's even huger here. You know, I have to say, I think apart from the schools on traditionally owned land, which I think have a set of problems that a lot of urban city schools in Australia don't really recognise or understand. You know, the kind of poverty that exists in the UK is kind of shocking to somebody from Australia. And, you know, and you know, it's not about, you know, I think schools that serve communities, that public policy has just made life almost unbearable at present in England. Schools have to make terrible choices now. And I have to say, I wouldn't be a head teacher in this country you couldn't pay me enough to make the kind of decisions that people have to make. You know, it's a country where kids are being hospitalised for rickets. You know, it's like the food poverty, for example. In the pandemic, we had examples of head teachers going into supermarkets and putting 1,000 quid's worth of food on their own credit cards and delivering it on foot. You know, it's truly shocking. At the same time, I think, you know, as anywhere, the arts can bring joy, comfort, healing, and I think people know that and probably appreciate that more now. And we have a kind of opportunity at the moment, I think, to think about not only the terrible decisions that people have to make, but also what actually helps people most in times of ongoing crisis. And I think there's a lot of thought and discussion about that in this country, and a lot of shock, I think, at the kind of not simply resource disparity, but disparities of life chances, actually, that there are, and you know, and actually lives that there are at present in this country. So, you know, I think we have to think as people committed to the arts, how we respond to these kinds of circumstances. Sorry, that's a real downer to end on. I'm sorry.
No, I was actually going to say that's a magnificent provocation, and actually that sums up what Create's been kind of established to do, to think about actually how the arts and creativity can make a difference to the lives of young people, people in hospitals, people in prisons and schools, like your work, Pat, and certainly like your work, Andrew. We're really committed and interested to making that happen. And thank you to both of you for such a rich conversation. I know in the chat box, people have been talking about how they're, you know, riffing off some of the ideas already and working with some of the ideas, and they've gone to find the report. So it's been just such a rich and generative discussion that I think will continue to resonate in people's minds. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your energy, and thank you for your ongoing commitment to this area, because it's through the work that both of you've done that, you know, we're able to do our work. So thank you, both of you, so much for your time.